With all the information that there is available to us in the world, how do you know what's true? We're going to take that question into the Forge. Hi, I'm Ron Matsen, and welcome to The Forge. This week, we're going to be looking at the concept of what is truth. We've had a number of people ask us, given especially the fact that there's so much going on in the media today, what is truth? How can you trust what's going on? Lori from Nebraska writes, with all the claims and counterclaims of fake news in the media today, how can I know what to believe anymore? And so we're going to be exploring that here. How do you know what to believe? There's so much available. We live in the information age, and as a result, we all have access to all kinds of information. How do we know what's true and what's false? On the program today, I'm going to have join me Chris Corlett. Good morning, Chris. How are you?
Ron, it's great to be with you. I'm doing fine.
Well, Chris is someone who has been 30 years in the classroom as a math teacher in the state of New York. He spent the last 11 years as a legal advocate for the State of New York United Teachers Union. He's also a board member of Koinonia House and Koinonia Institute. And so you're one of the movers and shakers within our institute, especially with regards to the academic side related to Koinonia Institute. So, and you've done a lot of work in this area with critical thinking, especially with your background as a legal advocate. So give us a little bit of background. How did you get into that? And we'll move on from there to some questions.
Yeah, Ron, I think you capture well there's a tapestry of professional opportunities over the last 30 years. Most people would reckon that math is critical thinking and logical thinking. Many of your listeners may well remember doing proofs as part of a geometry math class. And for me, it was actually a very natural transition and frankly, a door that God opened up to move into the courtroom, so to speak. I'm not a lawyer, but I am able to advocate within hearings and within what we would think of as courtrooms, not legal courtrooms, but within courtrooms, and advocate on behalf of clients to try to win a case. And the same logic that applies to the math room applies to the courtroom, and quite frankly, applies to the court of public opinion. As your question expressed, how do we know what to even trust? We have to put in the forge the claims and the counterclaims that we're hearing and figure out what comes out as pure and what comes out as a byproduct of that process. So all the professional opportunities that I've had actually have led me in different ways to the very topic that we're talking about within Koinonia Institute itself, along with the training that I've had as a member in KI, and then the opportunity to interact with members and to prepare products and be a part of enhancing and developing the program that we have. Really, all of that revolves around the very topic I think that you posed tonight. So I'm excited again to be a part of that conversation.
Well, we're going to really focus this evening in the aspect of what is referred to as critical thinking. You know, when I use that term, some people think that it means that you're just critical, criticize.
Right.
And of course, as Christians, you do run into that mentality sometimes that says where they actually misquote Ruth Graham, Billy Graham's wife, who said, God said it, I believe it, that settles it, sort of an approach to, well, I don't need to prove anything. And the truth of the matter is, if we expect to be salt and light in the world, we need to have a message that can at least be tested in proven methods, and also for ourselves to understand what is true and what is not. My experience has been many times that the people in the church have been really caught out by embracing things that later on are disproved. And so we want to make that a focus not only of this program, but as I approached this program, really saw that as laying a foundation for what we do here on the Forge and its association with Koinonia Institute and Koinonia House, the publisher. So you sort of have, from your experience, some things we want to look at with regards to the burden of proof. So take us through that sort of approach.
Yeah, I think your comments on critical is interesting, and if listeners prefer the word critiquing, that might be helpful in making that distinction. But really, it's the difference between judgment and discernment. We're not here to judge the heart. We're here to discern the argument. We're here to critically, in the sense that it's important, and critically in the sense of with a process, an approach that can stand up to an analysis itself, to consider the kind of thinking. And when I prepare a case that I'm going to present in a hearing or in a courtroom, I always accept on myself that I have what I call an evidentiary burden. There's a burden I have to put evidence to support my position, and then I have a persuasive burden. The evidence in and of itself doesn't win the argument. I have to find a way to be persuasive. And since I put that burden on myself in my practice, I put that same burden on every teaching, every presentation, every news article, every video I see. If someone is going to take up the next hour of my time, what's your evidence? And persuade me that that evidence leads to the conclusion that you want me to reach.
So really, this becomes a toolkit that John Doe, Christian, should be able to utilize to screen and to filter all the information, because we are certainly inundated with so much information. It's difficult to figure out how do I believe them because they're tall, or because they shout, or because they whisper. And so take us through some of the sense of what the evidentiary burden is. What does that mean?
So evidentiary burdens begins with what, it's what are the facts? What are the facts? But understanding that there's facts that are beyond dispute, but there's facts that people have to put into their argument, which we cannot in and of themselves say yay and amen or deny. In fact, and Ron, what we're subjected to is something called confirmation bias. What we tend to do is we tend to readily accept the facts which confirm our bias, which confirm what we've already concluded, and we tend to reject the facts that don't. This is evidenced by the observation that so many people listen to a particular news feed, because that news feed is more apt to say what they already think is correct. This isn't nefarious. It's natural. It's understandable. It's who we are. In fact, it's interesting that although it sounds like we shouldn't do that in the court of public opinion, it's exactly what we do in the court of competent jurisdiction. When I'm in a courtroom, everybody understands I'm putting forth the facts that make my case. That's what I'm doing. I'm not saying there aren't any facts which might contribute, which might be what I call headwinds to my case, or that there might not be another position that can be, but what are the facts that I'm going to establish that I will then use to persuade you that I am correct? And these facts can take the form of testimony. They can take the form of documents. They can take the form of expert witnesses. They can take the form of physical evidence. We all have seen enough movies and enough TV shows to understand that a gun with fingerprints found at the scene of the murder is somewhat compelling evidence. However, we've also seen that it wasn't necessarily that people may jump to the conclusion that whoever's fingerprints are on the gun was the murderer, but then in the way the movie plays out, that wasn't the case. So we have to, are the facts reliable in and of themselves? And then are they relevant? And this is always the question, is the evidence reliable? And it is irrelevant. Most of us jump at relevant. We just want what's relevant. We don't, our human nature is if it confirms what we want, it's relevant, and I'm not going to. What we really need to do is what's reliable. What can we absolutely know for certain? And then start from that to develop our opinion and to reach our conclusion. So what are the facts I'm using to make my argument? I have the burden to prove that they're reliable, and I have the burden to prove they're relevant. In fact, we've seen enough, again, courtroom dramas These are what a lot of the objections are. Objection, leading. Objection, hearsay. Objection, argumentative. And these are all objections which call into question either the relevance or the reliability. Hearsay is not necessarily reliable. Somebody might have misheard. Somebody might have misremembered. So that's not considered a reliable. There are several exceptions to the hearsay for other reasons. I don't want to get into that in the scope of this. But that's an example. We all say that, that's hearsay. All you're saying is that I'd rather hear from the original person that said it, what they said. It's interesting, Ron, that the Bible calls for 2 or 3 witnesses, that to be an apostle, you had to be an eyewitness to Jesus and his resurrection. And yet people that are antagonistic to the foundational principles of the Bible want to immediately reject the witnesses as recorded in the New Testament.
Right.
They want to quickly discard that, and yet those were the eyewitnesses. They are very reliable. And how often do we want to talk about first century secular writers because they were witnesses to what happened? So this is very important in evidence. What did you see? This is called direct evidence. People that had direct knowledge of what happened. They saw, they heard, they witnessed what happened. And then there's circumstantial evidence, and that's all the other kinds of evidence that, we saw there was a meeting between part of the U.S. Washington presidential team and a Russian. Well, we weren't there. We don't know what was said. It's a circumstance. And depending upon how you're already leaning on the thing, but we don't know if it's relevant to anything. Actually, it's very reliable because the individual released the emails. I call that evidence against interest. I mean, there's no more compelling evidence than evidence you release about yourself. This is why we put so much stock, Ron, in videotape, because you can see the person doing it. I don't know how widespread the viewership saw this, but a couple of years ago, and I'm not taking a position on this, I'm just saying it from an evidentiary point of view, there was a football player who got on an elevator with his fiancée, and when they got off the elevator, she was unconscious. And there was some modest outrage, but actually very little was happening, although there was really no other conclusion that something happened on the elevator. But a few weeks, I can't remember, a month later, a video on the elevator came out showing that he had hit her and knocked her out. And then there was outrage because we saw with our own eyes a video of exactly what happened. Eyewitness testimony is called for in the Bible, and it's very, very convincing. It should be very convincing. It's very relevant. It's very relevant. And what we do in courts is we try to erode the reliability. We either say the person forgot or they didn't see something, but with a video, you don't have that ability. So under this evidentiary burden, what are the facts? What are we going to use? What's reliable? What's relevant?
Well, let me stop you there and let me retrace a little bit, because I've got a couple of questions that you teased out as you were making your summary there, and that is, when you are, of course, speaking of facts as though you were gaining them as an advocate, but we also want to encourage people to gain facts for the sake of being discerning. In other words, have a clean slate. And in doing so, they need to not just collect the facts that substantiate their predisposition, but also the facts that might call their predisposition into question. To make a fair judgment, especially with regards to biblical things, I see this all the time. I see people who study a certain vein of systematic theology, and they can tell you chapter and verse of everything that substantiates their particular point of view, and they're very good at it. The problem is, of course, they don't address the scriptures that might have a different take on it, or even call it into question, because that's not what they're trying to achieve. So when we're talking about acquiring evidence, yes, there's that of being an advocate, but the broader sense of what we want to encourage within the body of Christ are those who at least declare their bias. I'm already predisposed of such and such, but I will tell you there are some problems with that point of view, and here are the facts associated with it. Here are the opinions associated with it. I don't have to embrace it, but that's a more fair-minded way. Interesting, isn't it? That's what Paul said of the Bereans, right? He said they were fair-minded in that they listened to what he said, but searched the scriptures daily to see if what he said was true. And I think we need to, but they listened with all readiness of heart. There was a readiness there to say, okay, I'm ready to hear something that might cause me to disengage myself from a preposition. So one is establishing facts that tell the whole picture, and that can be an uncomfortable situation, can't it?
And what I like to say for that, I alluded to it earlier, is we focus on what's reliable first, not what's relevant.
Yes.
And that's that confirmation bias. In fact, you mentioned Acts 17. A few chapters later in Acts 20, Paul says, I did not fail to declare the whole counsel of God. And let's face it, there's almost everything that there's a verse that we have to deal with. I call those the headwinds to my argument. Doesn't mean I'm wrong. It doesn't mean I'm going the wrong direction, but it'll slow you down a little bit. And as you point out, Ron, very, very properly, we have to address them. In fact, as part of my practice, in my opening remarks, as I present my case, if I know that there's a big pothole waiting for me, I address it in the opening comments. My opponent is likely to bring up the fact, and that will not be disputed. And then whatever I'm going to say. That's just good scholarship, isn't it? And that's just being genuine and having integrity. You have to recognize that there is almost nothing where, we'll talk maybe at some point about this phrase, preponderance of the evidence. Very, very few things have 100% of the evidence on one side and nothing on the other side.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that now, because we're gonna come to that. But the issue has to do with how you unpack all of that, isn't it? Another thing I wanted to address was the sense of the sense of the source. Let me go to this next thing that just goes into a little more detail on evidentiary burden. And we talked about it before coming on the program. I captured a few of the notes. And you said the very first thing is to lay the foundation. Explain that to us.
So whenever I put a witness on a stand, or whenever I submit a document for evidence or whatever, I have to lay a foundation. I have to give a reason for the court, whether it's the judge or the jury, to have any interest in what this person is going to say or what this document might have to say. One of the things, and I'm going to actually reference an earlier Forge video that I watched when you interviewed Joel Richardson, is in the front part of that interview, you gave Joel time to talk about himself. And you're left with the sense that he knows what he's talking about. He's lived it. He's done it. This isn't some book that he read or a report that he saw. This is something he can speak to clearly and competently and compellingly because he is qualified. We don't want to have someone who knows nothing about nuclear science to be entering evidence about nuclear science. At best, he's something that person read out of a book.
Right.
Well, then we would just enter the book. So it's very important to lay a foundation that establishes the credibility. Why do we care what this source has to say? And a phrase that you and I talked about was there's credibility in the doing. Every one of us wants an experienced person working on our car, or an experienced doctor doing the surgery, and you fill in the blanks. And we all understand that everybody's got to start somewhere, but we really don't want to be anybody's first attempt at something important.
Yes.
So there's credibility in the doing. And so somebody like Joel and yourself, somebody who's traveled to the Middle East, I'd rather hear what they have to say than somebody who read about the Middle East, for example.
Right.
So this is all the idea of laying a foundation. Why is this person in the chair giving testimony? Why is this document being entered in? What's it got to do? And is it a reliable, relevant, credible source of information? So that's really where the evidentiary burden begins. And by the way, we don't do this. We do it in this capacity. Oh, I like so-and-so. They're a really good news anchor. Okay,
right,
so then that's the foundation. Okay. What's that?
He's a good-looking guy. Yeah, this is real fundamental, I think, here, because if you make that mistake at the front end, you'll believe whatever comes out afterwards.
Exactly, yeah.
And the sense, I can't tell you the number of times people will send in questions or statements which they have heard from a source that heard from a source. And when we go and actually try to research, where is this coming from? Who is saying this? They're all quoting each other. What you find, and the internet is very sophisticated now, where you can you can take entire chapters of a book and search it and say, who else is saying this?
Right.
And what's amazing is how often, especially Christian sites, will just quote each other. And so someone will make a statement about something, and then someone else will pick it up, put it in a blog, and you know it's suspicious when the first time a reference to something comes up is not from a source document, but from somebody's personal opinion, Facebook, or a blog.
Yes.
And so when you're talking about qualify the source, it's not just the quality of the person, which is important, by the way. You know, are they someone who has some credibility there? But also, when we're dealing with documents which are written, where did that document come from? The archaeologist, when they take something out of the ground and declare, this is where I found it, they have a process they go through to document through photographs and measurements, localities, where did this come out, at what depth, who dug it up, and so on and so forth. And sadly, so much in Christendom with regards to facts does not have that type of source evaluation. And that's important, isn't it? To evaluate the source.
Yes.
Where is this coming from?
Well said. And what you described in as you were talking, Ron, is also the illusion of multiple sources, but they're all just quoting each other.
Yes.
And another issue that's coming up a lot is anonymous sources.
Yeah.
Now, isn't that interesting? See, there's no way to lay a foundation to an anonymous source.
Right.
Everybody that's ever been in a school knows that if you get an anonymous letter complaining about a teacher or something, you ignore it.
Yep.
Because there's nothing that we all know that. And it's true in business, it's true in anything. And yet, if somebody is introducing quote unquote evidence from an anonymous source, but it supports what we wanted to support, then we're good with that.
Yeah, it makes headline news, doesn't it? I mean, that sadly, sitting down here in New Zealand and looking at the United States, it's astonishing that the first 5 months of the Trump presidency has been plagued with just allegations and this and that. You think the Congress and the president, the executive branch should be governing the nation and trying to fix what's broken. But anyway, not that I want to get off on that, but there's an example of qualify the source. And then you say, what's the next step behind that? After you qualify the source, you feel this is a good source, they've got good information, good references, footnoted, I can see what research has been done. What's the next step then?
And then while you're doing this, you're asking yourself, what's the issue I'm trying to address? And when I do an issue in a case, I try to hone it, I try to refine it, I try to narrow it very precisely. In other words, I'm not going to, putting in a biblical context, is the Old Testament reliable? Just this very broad, it might be better to ask, is the Torah reliable? Or it might be better to ask, is the Torah consistent? Or it might be better to ask, is the use of a particular word used consistently throughout the Torah? And I'm using that, it's not a great, but it's just this idea of refining your issue. What do you actually, and truthfully, Ron, in a quality debate, and there are many of them, not the debates that are called debates on TV, which are little more than entertainment at best, but a proper debate refines the issue. The two sides bring up legitimate and reasonable points, and the other side says, all right, I'm only applying it now to this issue. I'm only applying it to this. Right. And gradually you refine it. And a great example that your viewers might be interested is to watch debates between a gentleman named Gary Habermas and an atheist named, I can't think of his first name, it's Flew. And they debated the resurrection back and forth. And they were quality debates, fair debates, informed debates, and a beautiful story. Flew, towards the end of his life, accepted Jesus as his Lord and Savior.
Wow.
He became convinced that he did rise from the dead. But as you watch these debates, these were not nasty. They were not just making bumper sticker assertions. They were full of evidence. They were full of thought. They were full of respect for the other side, refining our position. And a quality debate is not won or lost. The win is that the issue is better defined. So when I prepare a hearing, I have to refine my issue. I have to make my issue clear that I want the court to rule on. Excuse me.
Well, one of the temptations, I think, with all of us, especially given in this fast-paced information tsunami that we're just living in, we're just being overwhelmed, and that is that it's easy to buy into soundbite conclusions. Yes. In other words, it's clever, it has a ring to it, there's perhaps some alliteration involved in it, easily remembered, said in such a way at such a time, and I grab onto these sound bites, and they're sort of the meme of news. Let's reduce a whole thought to a picture, a smiley face, and my reaction is some type of LOL meme that I chuck out there, and pretty soon I'm no longer really communicating with substance. What I'm doing is I'm just simply giving sound bites back and forth. Oh, of course that guy's a crook anyway, and as if to dismiss whatever he's saying. And it really, first of all, it's unnecessary if you're truly looking for truth to resort to that type of approach. Yes. But it's also demeaning to you as an individual that you're not actually serious about trying to find truth. You'd rather find a soundbite that you can latch onto. And so that's that whole idea of laying the foundation. What is the issue? It needs to be refined. And then you had a third point there under evidentiary burden.
What is the and the third point is what is the evidence? As you were talking, Ron, and I don't know if all of our listeners know this, but Oxford Dictionary in 2016, the word of the year was post-truth.
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 What on earth is that?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and frankly, I plan on talking about that at the October conference. What is the meaning of post-truth, and what is the implications of that? But I bring it up here there's an acknowledgement from the Oxford Dictionary that we're beyond even knowing truth. I think of the verse in the New Testament where Paul said, "Ever learning and never coming to the knowledge of the truth." 2 Timothy 3:7, I believe. And we live in that time, don't we? We're redoubling knowledge, but we're not coming to truth.
Right.
We're not reaching truth. And now that task has all been made impossible according to the Oxford Dictionary because we're living a post-truth era.
Right.
And what they're basically saying is truth no longer has to rely on evidence. They do define it, and we can I don't want to necessarily derail the focus of where we are right now, but all our viewers and listeners, all they have to do is go look up Oxford Word of the Year 2016 post-truth, and they can read articles about it. It was in the January, February, March, the early part of this year, that it was being covered in the news. So once we know what the issue is, we have a narrow, and we've laid a foundation. Now, what's the evidence that foundation is going to be able to give us? Is it going to be a particular speaker who is well qualified? And then what is the evidence that they can bring forward? Ron, I think of your presentation in last week's edition of The Forge, where you had pictures of the burnt mountaintop. You had Google Maps. That's a reliable source. We understand that Google Maps is going to be reasonably reliable. I dare say probably not perfect. I know that the pictures are taken not on a continuous basis, so some places may look different, but the places that you use Google Maps for are reliable. See what I'm saying?
Yes.
You laid a foundation. Google Maps, that's a trusted source. You had an issue you were you went through a bullet point about the sorts of things that you would be obligated to demonstrate. And then you provided the evidence, whether it was pictures or maps or, the different kinds of things you did. And so I actually want to submit last week's Forge as an example of meeting this evidentiary burden. It is replete with various evidences throughout it. That was really the entire presentation. You put upon yourself, if I'm right, then I have to be able to show, where the rock was split and the water came out. And I have to be able to show where the land bridges might have been. And I have to be able to show you demonstrated accepting that evidentiary burden in these three things. What's the evidence? What's the issue you're trying to prove? And you laid a foundation for why that evidence was compelling.
Right. Now, you mentioned in our beginning the sense of persuasive burden. Explain what that is.
Yes. So now we have some evidence, and most hearings are what are called evidentiary hearings. Although you're revealing what your arguments are going to be, you're just getting evidence for the record. So now both sides have a record of evidence. Now I have to persuade you, and in most of the cases I do, it's either closing arguments or it's a brief. You write a brief and you make your arguments. So the first thing is we have to understand what's the quantum of proof? What is the degree of obligation? How certain do I have to convince you of something that's not certain? For example, let's say I'm trying to make the case that we're going to have an increase in hurricanes next year. Well, okay, that's a worthwhile thing to know. And maybe I'm well qualified. I'm not, but I'm just for an example. So do I have to give you what we usually refer to as a preponderance of the evidence, which is given two scales, a balanced scales of justice, it'll tip one way. A little bit more of the evidence supports my position than opposes my position. Some people say 50% plus one. Just a little,
right.
But there's no firm percentage. Clear and compelling, people tend to think of that as being like 70% to 80% or somewhere in there. That, it's pretty clear and compelling. Yes, there's some headwinds, but for the most part, the best evidence in this case really points to your argument. And we've all heard the phrase beyond reasonable doubt. That's the standard in most murder trials. And in murder one, you have to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. There can be really no doubt that a reasonable person would have left. And that's like 95%, 98%. Again, there's no real numbers to it. I'm just trying to give a sense to what our listeners are. So before we do anything, when we listen to a news story or a Bible teacher or a what is our quantum of proof? What are we expecting them to do? Give us a little bit of evidence, give us a lot of evidence, or give us overwhelming evidence, to say it in a simple fashion. And we should also ask the question of the presenter, what did the presenter try to do? Are they trying to skin along? Now, I will tell you that lots of evidence doesn't necessarily win the argument. I had a case once where I won't really go into the details of it, but the very issue, I had the very narrow issue of what I was trying to prove, and I found a document signed by the representative of the other side, which confirmed what we were arguing.
Right.
I only needed to put that one piece of evidence in. One piece was done. Beyond a reasonable doubt, he'd already said it. He'd forgotten he'd said it.
Right.
Or he changed his mind. That's what happened. And quite frankly, if it was a little bit more reasonable, this would have been a settled out of court. But they were unwilling to have a conversation with me, so I just presented it, and everybody turned white, and they said, can we have a 5-minute recess? And it was we had to settle in court. But point was, it settled. One piece of evidence settled the issue. That was it, because it was such good evidence. It was his evidence. It was his signature. It was an original even. So it's not necessarily, and this is what happens in a lot of, you were talking about Facebook. Some people just want to overwhelm you with their 53 posts.
Yes.
They're just going to respond to everything you say. They're just going to have an answer. And it looks like they really, but none of it is compelling. None of it's impressive. None of it's dispositive is a word that we like to use. It doesn't dispose the issue. So what is the quantum of proof? Do we want just a slight tipping of the scales, pretty significant tipping, or that there's no reasonable doubt left? Part of that depends upon how important the issue is. If we're trying to argue about where we went last summer for our vacation, we can't quite remember where we went, maybe that's one we can let go. But and let's face it, we do get into some pretty frivolous arguments, but we're talking about the big ones. So how much proof do I insist on? The next thing is, what is the standard? Is there some standard I have to meet? Now, in a courtroom, I guess we all know murder. Everybody knows that murder, you have to have means, motive, and opportunity. Everybody knows that. That's the standard for murder. And if you fail to prove that there are means, motive, and opportunity, you probably lose the case as a prosecutor.
Right.
You have to have all three things. Well, there's countless standards in different, depending on what it is you're arguing. And I don't want to run, because like you say, this is all just about a legal case, but the principles of the courtroom can be applied to all this. So is there a standard? One thing that a way that this often comes up is, let's say you're arguing for the existence of God with an atheist. So you might ask the atheist, what do I need to prove to you that would be convincing? You're asking him, what's your standard? Do I have to prove to you? And they say, well, you have to prove to me that nothing bad ever happens.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a ridiculous standard. I've already lost the argument. I can't win that argument because that's absurd. You have to prove to me that God cries when something bad happens. Okay, well, you have to prove that God doesn't want anything bad to happen. Like, what's your standard? What is and it's somewhere along the way, and we have to modify these things if we're listening to something on YouTube, we can't ask them these questions. But the point is, what is the standard that this person has to reach? It's not fair if they do a pretty good presentation. You say, well, you didn't quite convince me. If you'd only said this.
It's sort of that sense of moving the goalpost, isn't it? I mean, surely.
Right.
And you want to establish where the goal line is. Because nothing is more demoralizing than somebody says, well, you just need to give me compelling evidence that there's a designer behind the universe or whatever. And so you give what should be considered at least reasonable information, well documented, well resourced, with pictures in color, if you want, so to speak, only to have them say, yeah, but I'm still not buying that. As if they never came
beyond any doubt.
Yeah,
they changed the quantity.
I got to tell you a story that goes along with that. When my wife and I were first married, we're living in Southern California. We had a little thing we like to do on Saturdays. Sometimes we would go out to all of the car dealerships, and we wanted to drive the new cars, and we couldn't afford one. But we wanted to drive the new cars. So in the States, you could go up and say, I'd like to drive that car, and they'd give you the keys, and you take it out and drive it around. And when you'd come back, they'd want to sell you the car. Well, of course, I wasn't prepared to buy the car. I just wanted to drive the car. And I'll hold my hand up and say now in hindsight, that was a wrong thing to do. But nonetheless, there was one fella that we took the car out, and the guy said, well, I'll let you take the car out if you tell me right now that if I make you the right deal, you'll buy that car today. Well, I couldn't honestly say that because I wasn't prepared to accept that conclusion. Yes. And so, I had to, with great embarrassment on my face, hand the keys back to him and say, no, I've got to look elsewhere. I never did that again. I realized I'm wasting these people's time, and that was a naughty thing on my part. But there's an example of someone who was feigning as though I'm searching for truth, but I'm just playing with you. And that was wrong on my part. And I'll probably get lots of emails now shaming me after this. But you understand what I'm trying to get to. I sometimes feel that I'm on the receiving side of that sometimes. That when you are on a quest with an individual, again, as an advocate, as an ambassador of Christ, we're his advocate with the world. And that's one angle that we're coming at, that we should be able to understand what needs to be presented and how to present it. But also from a discernment point of view, we also need to examine all the facts, come with an open mind, come with a mind that can be guided to the light of the truth. And so there's that sense of also checking your own heart out. Where are you in this? What is your standard of proof, is what you're saying.
Yes. Very often, I appreciate the story you told, and very often as we're trying to reach a settlement in an issue, and one side will say, well, all we need is this. Well, we can do that but then we need this too. Well, And eventually there comes a point where you realize these people don't want to settle. They don't really want to settle.
Right.
It's not really a settlement. So there are negotiations that happen very quickly when two people are genuine and I need this, we can do that, done. And then there's this sort of game playing when we're trying, and I'm saying that, and that's what I hear you saying in the story, that there's this game playing where we just keep moving the target and moving around. Right. So you can never actually win anything, right, because no standard has ever been set for what we have to accomplish.
Right. And it's important to establish that going in, even in your own life, as you were exploring, is there any credibility to this doctrine or this claim made by this prophecy teacher or whatever? I'm being very careful not to mention any of them now because we'll perhaps be testing some of those later in the Forge. But the whole idea is to say, but what's the objective here? What is going to be the burden of proof, both in the case of the protagonist and those who would be taking the opponent view and the antagonist? What is the objective in each of their roles?
And Ron, you actually raised an interesting thing there. You mentioned burden of proof. In cases, only one side, usually the moving party or the charging party, or in the context of what we're saying here, the presenter, they're the ones with the burden of proof.
Correct. Yeah,
I don't have to prove anything. I'm not presenting. In a debate, you both have a burden of proof.
Yes.
As a presentation, if you're listening to a newscast or a YouTube video or whatever, there is no burden of proof on you. But if you're a genuine seeker of truth, then you will require a foundation for the speaker. You will understand clearly what their issue, what their point is. You will have some sense of what the quantum of proof needs to be, some sense of a standard that you're going to hold them to. But very often people think that the other person lost if they can just have that. But this is what happened to me. And somehow that disposes the entire argument. There's only one burden of proof, unless it's a debate. There's only one burden of proof because there's only one person making the case or making the presentation. And in a courtroom, the burden of proof is on the charging party. If they fail to meet the burden of proof, they lose.
Yes.
Even if the other person didn't actually prove their side.
Yeah.
So there is that part of it too. It's a nuance. Yeah. And but I do think it has an application when we're talking. I've actually made the comment when I've been sharing my faith. I says, I don't need to win this argument. You need to lose it.
Right.
I don't win anything by winning, but you win something by losing.
Yes, yes.
So, and in a sense, I'm trying to address the burden of proof without just saying those words. And, when you're in, and we've all been there, when you're in that conversation that has the hopes of getting somewhere.
Yes.
I'm not talking about just a exchange on Facebook, whatever, but it's midnight. You've been talking with somebody for a couple hours, they're asking good, hard questions. And sometimes I'll say, listen, I know I'm the person that's trying to prove something. And in my mind, I've got the burden of proof, but I don't need to win this as much as you need to lose this argument.
Right. Yes. Well, there's one other thing I wanted before we move on to just sort of how we're going to conclude this, and that is the sense of a lot of people use the term to describe a practice called debate, which most people don't even understand what a real debate is. A debate is there are two opponents, and it goes through three steps. Each opponent makes its case. And if you were in a formal debate, it would be 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever you have to make your case. And then after each side has made point, counterpoint, then the second phase is the rebuttal. So party number A can comment and bring to question things made by party number B, and so on and so forth. And so the second phase is that of just rebuttal, pointing out perhaps some things that don't add up. And then once they've each had a chance to rebut each other, then they do a summary. They just come to their summary conclusion. It's amazing how many people will say to me, well, we'd love to have you debate that doctrine on television. When I was in England, I had a television program there for 2.5 years, and there was an individual who came along, and the television station said he holds one view on the rapture, you hold another view on the rapture. We'd like you to come and debate that issue. And I told him I was uncomfortable with it, not that I could not defend my position, but because the perception of debate is nothing more than just arguing. that you
Yes.
it's one-upsmanship, and that's not debate. That is
Right.
nothing more than just contention, and nothing good comes out of contention in that manner. And so when people talk about, well, can't we debate this? You want to say, okay, well, debate allows for a statement, a rebuttal, and a summary. And that's really where you're going to lead us, isn't it? The final
Yes.
step in this is your concluding argument. So give us some more insight on that.
Exactly. So we've put evidence in, and we've had it scrutinized by the opposing side. We've had it scrutinized by the judge or the hearing officer. We have established what it is we have to prove, how much evidence, how convincing the evidence, what are the key components of the standard. So in a legal opportunity, we either have what we would call closing arguments, where I'm just going to explain my case. In what I practice, that's relatively rare, but that would be if you're going to get a bench decision, you have your last chance to summarize everything. And this is where, I remember, Ron, earlier you said alliteration, and a couple clever lines, a cute story, some alliteration can be very helpful in just packaging how all this comes together and makes a case. What I do more is I write what are called briefs. I think briefs are supposed to be brief, but anybody that knows me knows I can't be. So my briefs tend to be pretty long and pretty well thought out. But I will tell you this. Every brief I write, I do what I have called the rule of three. I want 3 main points. I don't want 73 main points. We all know, as I know from when I was a teacher in a public high school, if a kid came in and had 73 reasons why they were late, none of them were good reasons. The sheer volume of reasons that you have tell me that you don't believe any of them are good. If I also call it swinging after the bell. In boxing, the bell rings, you keep punching. If you think you're winning the match, you don't have to do that. You're doing it because you think you're losing the match. So you keep on swinging. So just, you should be able to condense your argument down to 1, 2, or 3 key points that the evidence supports, and maybe you have to address a headwind or maybe not. But and in the I'm sorry, Ron. In the video that I put together, I talk about what I call the least evidence principle. What's the best thing you can put forward? Put your best argument forward in your closing. So you might talk for 50 minutes, but the fact of the matter is, in 5 minutes, you can say everything you wanted to say. You wrap it up. There's a practice in presentation that says, tell them what you're going to say it, and then tell them what they just said, what they just heard. And that's what you're doing. What did you just hear? How does it come down? How does it play? Now, in terms of our fake news issue, usually we're just going on to the next story. Ron, it's what you were saying before, that it's just a stream of conscious, isn't it? It's just one fact or one claim after another, and there's very little time to reflect at the end about what it is. But here's the other thing. Very few important issues are settled in 50 minutes. But you should, at the end, have refined your belief, refined your position, refined your understanding. You should have follow-up questions that you want to go pursue. You should want to go check a source. If anybody has done a decent job in presenting their point, you should be left with actions you can take. And that's really what the judge does. They'll go research. You'll quote a couple of cases. They'll go research those cases. They'll go whatever. There's more to be done. And it's, we think sometimes of like you say, a debate or an argument as being a football game. And when it says 0-0-0 on the clock, we have a winner and a loser. That is really not the way most of this plays out. Let's use the analogy of the forge. That the metal is being perfected over time, and it's coming more and more into clarity what it is, and the edge is getting sharper and sharper. Iron sharpens iron, right? It's not something that just happens. It's a process. It's an ongoing process. So just to try to capture that feeling at the end, yes, you're trying to make the case at the end, but in the case of the kinds of things we're talking about that are issues of faith or issues of importance in that regard, most of these things aren't simply resolved at the end of a 50-minute presentation.
All right. Well, at the end of this presentation, we're going to now follow that pattern, take you back to the very first question from Lori, where she simply asks, so given all the fake news and information and claims and counterclaims, what would be, in simple terms, your recommendation to them to know, how do I know in what to believe? So give us a summary.
I actually do go pretty much through the process that we've outlined over the last several minutes. I ask myself if there's anybody who's credible in this. So let's say I saw a news article. Is there anybody credible? Was it anonymous witnesses? Do we have a name? Do I trust that person? Do they have is there any reason why I think they should know more about this than something else? What is the evidence for the claim? What are they claiming? We alluded earlier. Are they claiming that the election was affected by Russian something? Are they claiming that somebody's character is bad because they talked to a Russian? Are they claiming that the next election is going to be really go pear-shaped unless we deal with what are they actually claiming? And we understand in the political atmosphere we're in, most of it is simply there's an outcome that people want to see, and they're just going to keep piling on evidence. They're not really, but I say this all the time as my wife and I are watching news stories, both on mainstream media, but frankly, and more on the internet, because that's where you get more reliable and useful information, in my view. But I also believe in multiple sources, so I try to listen to everybody. But as I'm listening to these things, I'm saying, what is their point? What is the issue? So I really do go through this process. It takes on different forms. It takes on different levels of intensity. But the different principles that we talked about, we go through. It's not a simple process. And I also understand I'm not going to get it right every time. This isn't something I have to get 100 on the test.
Right.
I don't have to figure out every right and wrong story. And I will say this: there's nothing more reliable than God's word. Amen. I mean,
amen.
Everything's got to be lined up to God's word, one way or another.
Yep.
And so that's our best stuff.
And again, the very sense of what this program is about proving all things, holding fast to that which is true. Chris, Thank you very much for being with us on the program. And can't wait until we see each other in October at our conference there. Look forward to your presentation. And so for our viewing audience, I want to also extend to you an offer from Koinonia House and Koinonia Institute. We're going to take Chris Corlett's package called Critical Thinking, which is currently available as a DVD, an MP3, audio, DVDs, CDs, and so on and so forth. If you go to our website, khouse.org, you'll be able to download both the HD video and the MP3 audio. You'll be able to download that for free. If you want to actually buy the DVD or the audio CD, we're giving that away as a 50% discount. And so you want to get your copy of that. It's 2 hours worth of teaching on this subject. And so a lot more detail than we're able to cover in this 50 minutes. And so, again, thank you very much for joining us. And we just hope that you will commit yourself to testing all things, proving all things, holding fast to that which is true. May God bless you as you study His Word. God bless you.